Hi, my name is Brandy Petrie. I'm one of the counselors in the Counseling Center. I'm making this video on the concept of self-compassion. I think it's a really valuable life skill, but I think given the current climate, it's something that could be really useful in increasing our well-being. It's something that I've been learning a lot more about and have started to use a lot more in my work with students in the Counseling Center and have found it really valuable. I do want to preface the video by saying that you can't just watch a 10-minute YouTube video on self-compassion and be an expert on it and have an immediate change overnight. That being said, as we'll talk later in the video, there's a lot of research about how self-compassion can support us and enhance our well-being. So I hope you find it helpful. So what is self-compassion? I think to some extent it's fairly intuitive. People recognize that there's a need to be kind to themselves and to be gentle with themselves. But I think it's really useful to dig a little bit deeper into the understanding of self-compassion, which then lets us be better equipped to practice it in our daily lives. If we look at the research, we know that there are three main components to self-compassion. The first of which is self-kindness, and truly that is just being more kind and gentle with the words that we use toward ourselves as compared to really judgmental, harsh language. And for some people are very berating internally. One way that we can think about this that can be really useful in trying to change the way that we speak to ourselves is ask, the things that I'm saying to myself, are they things that I would say to a small child, or are they things that I would say to a friend or a loved one? The answer is often no. And so that begs the question, why do we think that that's okay to say to ourselves and acceptable to say those things to ourselves? When really we recognize with other people that it's not very motivating. Again, why would that be motivating for us? First and foremost, being mindful of the things that we say to ourselves. And later in the video, we'll talk about why people do kind of use that kind of language and why they can be so self-critical. The second component is something called common humanity, which basically is this idea that as human beings, we all experience suffering, we all experience pain and struggle, and those things are just part of being human and part of the human race. This is in contrast to a concept called psychological isolation, where we fall into this trap of thinking that I am the only one that has problems, or I'm the only one who experiences this, I'm the only one that feels this way, which, right, as the name implies, can be very isolating and can even lead to physical isolation and further problematic outcomes. So common humanity is really just recognizing that we are not alone in our suffering. The third component is mindfulness. And I know many people have reactions to mindfulness. I think a lot of that comes from maybe not really having a great understanding of what is mindfulness. If we try to explain it very simply, mindfulness is being right here in this present moment, not in the past and not in the future, and being right here in a non-judgmental way. For me, in my work, I think it can be helpful to speak about mindfulness along a continuum, with one end of the spectrum being avoidance. Speaking of common humanity, humans are excellent at finding ways to avoid. That's a very normal and natural response, but not always very helpful. So avoidance can be things like cognitive avoidance, thinking about something difficult or a difficult emotion. It can also be done through misuse of substances. Also, even things that we view as relatively positive. So maybe burying ourselves in work or excessive exercise are all ways that we may avoid. On the other end of the spectrum is something called over-identification, and that's basically this idea that we over-identify with a difficult emotion. We get stuck in it, we get trapped in it, and we don't really see a way out of that, which is partly why people do avoid, because they fear that side of the spectrum. Mindfulness is really kind of right in the middle there. There's awareness of what is going on without becoming so attached and overly involved in it, but also not just completely ignoring the suffering. Mindfulness is definitely a key component of self-compassion, because how can we be kind to ourselves? How can we think about common humanity? How can we decide how to proceed if we're not even aware that we're in distress, or we're not really fully acknowledging the distress that we're experiencing? So it is a very key aspect of self-compassion. I just want to spend a moment talking about the research behind self-compassion. When people begin to practice self-compassion, sometimes there's a lot of ambivalence about doing so, and there's good reason for that. But much of the reasons are kind of based in myths around self-compassion. So the research helps us kind of combat that. One of the biggest things we see is that people are very concerned that if they practice self-compassion, that they will no longer be motivated, they will no longer achieve their goals and do the things that are required of them. The research is really quite contrary to that. What we see is individuals who are self-compassionate actually tend to be more motivated and are more successful at achieving their goals. So it's really important to realize that self-compassion is not letting yourself off the hook, so to speak, as some people call it. And the reason why self-compassion helps us stay motivated and helps us achieve our goals is when we have something go wrong and we berate ourselves, that often makes us feel worse about ourselves. It leads to changes in mood and functioning in a way that really doesn't motivate us and doesn't make us want to kind of get back on the horse, so to speak. Where self-compassion, we can be kind and we can pause and we can kind of observe the situation more objectively and look at what went wrong, what needs to happen now moving forward, what do I need to be better, and that is much more motivating to try again and to be successful than beating ourselves up. And so that's why it's really important to recognize the research really suggests that self-compassionate individuals are actually more motivated and more successful. Self-compassion is not a stress management technique. Like I said, it's more of a life skill. That being said, interestingly, the individuals who are more self-compassionate do report less depressive symptoms, do report less anxiety and distress, and are better able to handle those difficult times. It doesn't mean that there's no stress in their life or there's no mood symptoms, but it does make them better equipped to handling them. We also see improvements in physical health. We even see help with chronic pain and also immune functioning. So you can really see how self-compassion and a regular practice of it is really beneficial to both our physical and our mental health. So we've talked about what is self-compassion, and we've talked about the research to give you a sense of how it can have an impact on your well-being and whether maybe you'd like to create a self-compassion practice in your own life. The next question is exactly how do I practice this in my day-to-day life? And for me, in my experience, people are often looking for something fairly tangible to do so that they know they're on track and that they're working toward their goal of self-compassion or whatever it may be. So what I'm going to teach is something called the self-compassion break, which is an informal practice in self-compassion, but also a very core aspect of learning it and practicing it. The self-compassion break is designed for us to use anytime we feel discomfort, big or small. And in fact, we should use it on a daily basis, even with small things, because that helps us build confidence and gives us a foundation for when bigger things come up in life. The self-compassion break is basically creating a mantra using the three components of self-compassion. And we do this because it's a good way to pause and be mindful and be kind. And when we have something already kind of in place and a structure in place, we're much more likely to remember to practice it. So before I kind of jump into how to do it, two things to keep in mind. The first of which is find language that feels good for you, that resonates with you. If you use somebody else's self-compassion break mantra, it likely won't work for you because it just won't make sense and you're not likely to use it. So again, find language that resonates with you. That being said, the only caveat is just to make sure that you are using all three components of self-compassion. So let's jump in. The first statement should really embody embody the mindfulness aspect, so we can immediately pause and realize that we're in some sort of distress. So that may mean a statement like, this is a moment of suffering, or this is discomfort, or I'm feeling stress. Any of those are fine, or you can come up with something that feels better for you. Anything that embodies mindfulness. The next statement should really embody the concept of common humanity. So that may look like saying something like, suffering is a part of life, I am not alone, others would feel this way. Again, find something creative if none of those fit for you. And then the last piece, of course, would be self-kindness. So that may mean saying something like, may I be kind to myself, may I give myself what I need. That in a nutshell is the self-compassion mantra and self-compassion break. You have 3 of those statements together, and again, it gives you that space and that moment to take a breath and be mindful and be kind. With that, some other questions that may kind of come up when you're in this self-compassion break, or maybe kind of meditating on it. Questions like, what do I need right now? What is the next best step? What is the most self-compassionate thing I can do for myself right now? One of the reactions that people have to self-compassion is sometimes they view it as kind of fluffy or weak, or maybe hippy-dippy, some people may say. The founders of self-compassion really talk about the yin and the yang of self-compassion. So yes, there is this aspect of comforting and supporting ourselves and soothing, but there's also the flip side of being really action-oriented and actually maybe being very fierce. Sometimes we may be put in a situation where we need to take care of ourselves, and self-compassion actually means taking action and really standing up for ourselves. And in that sense, it is in no way weak. So again, there's really a balance, and in any given moment, you need to ask yourself, what is it that I need right now? Sometimes it may be more about comforting, but other times maybe it's more about protecting yourself or taking definitive action. So that, in a nutshell, is the self-compassion break. Again, you can use that at any moment of distress, and you can see how it can lead to kind of stopping and thinking about what's the next course of action, and potentially motivate us to make a change for the better. So that being said, if you're still kind of wondering, how do I use the self-compassion break, there's a great audio file on a website that I can give you that walks you through the self-compassion break using an example from your own life to really help you understand how do I use it moving forward. This is a great time to talk about resources. If this video resonated with you and you think that self-compassion is something that you should practice in your life, one of the best places to start is selfcompassion.org, which is a website by Kristen Neff. She has a self-compassion assessment on there where you can take it and you can see how you compare with others on self-compassion, and you can see how you fare in terms of those 3 components of self-compassion, and where you may struggle or maybe where you do pretty well. And that's a really great place to start. There's also journal exercises on there to get you thinking about things from a self-compassionate standpoint and how to practice it more regularly. Another resource is the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion.org, and that's fantastic because it has many audio files that kind of walk you through various self-compassion exercises and meditations, and really gives you a sense of mindfulness and self-compassion and how to implement that on a regular basis. I hope this video has been useful and gives you a sense of if you want to continue incorporating self-compassion after this. If you have any questions about it, you can also reach out to the Counseling Center. I'm happy to answer any questions or provide guidance. And we also are still offering appointments, even though we miss seeing everybody face-to-face. We are able to offer video sessions or even phone calls, depending on your availability. accountability. So please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions or concerns. You can reach us by email at counselingcenter@coloradocollege.edu, or you can give us a call at 719-389-6093. I hope everybody is doing well. Please take care of yourselves and be kind, and we're looking forward to seeing everybody back on campus hopefully soon. Be well.